So my name's Clint Hansen. I'm an Iman Countryman. So if you don't know where Iman Country is, that's Central Queensland. I was born and raised on Darumbal Country in Rockhampton. The reason I was born on Darumbal Country in Rockhampton is due to forced removal of Iman people off of our country. After some massacres that happened, we were rounded up at Taroom Aboriginal Reserve in Taroom Country with a bunch of other mobs right up from Batdjala Country in the east, where Kgari Island is, Cape York in the north and south, as well as far as Kamilaroi Country. So from there, most of my family went to Woorabinda. From Woorabinda, you got rocky inland, east of that, at the coast. That's where I grew up and spent most of my life. The Wardingarri River, the Dawson River, is on Iman Country, so I have connections to that. It confluences with the MacKenzie River and hits the Tanuba River, known as the Dawson River to the whitefellas, which is Darumbal Country where I grew up, and that heads out into Woppaburra Sea Country. So all of that country is connected by those waterways there, and I'm connected to those different waterways, both fresh water and seawater, salt water, and have ties to that land. After that, a bit more about myself. I left school early at 15 to do an apprenticeship as a fitter machinist. I didn't really like school too much as some of the teachers and English teachers in particular wanted me to continue on to year 12. Moving to Meanjin Brisbane after I finished my trade, I think I was 22, really enjoyed my trade. I liked the hands-on work. Moved to Meanjin for about a year to 2 years. Realised through my trade that I was doing a lot of engineer work on a minimum wage as a trade. Like, engineers would come to me and get me to design stuff for them, like on lathes and mills. Started looking around and thought I need to go back to university, and thought, well, not back to university, go back to school and education per se. And I thought, how am I going to do this? You know, I left school at 15, I don't have an ATAR or an OP or anything like that. And I looked up all the different universities, some in Meanjin and Brisbane, some down here, and RMIT had vocational education bridging into higher ed. So I did a 2-year vocational education Advanced Diploma Mechanical Engineering, and if you get a certain grade point average out of 4, 3 out of 4 and above, you can take a year and a half of the same field and topic in the Batdjala. So I did that. And then this leads me into talking a little bit about changing topics from mechanical engineering into my undergrad, which was sustainable systems engineering. So the reason changing, I went back, I'm not sure if you know much about native title or prescribed body corporates, but the Iman Native Title, we won Native Title in 2016 in federal court on country, which was a beautiful celebration and recognition of our connection to country and that as our land and country. And part of the meetings growing up, going to the native title, but then even recently, as recent as 4 or 5 years ago, when I was studying down here doing mechanical engineering, I was going to these meetings back home in Rockhampton, the PBCs, and proponents and representatives from different gas companies and conglomerates would sort of give presentations to our community about what was happening on our country. Some of that was petroleum industry, so gas wells, rather than just like Central Queensland, if you don't know, is heavily densely populated by the extractive industry, both coal and petroleum, but gas, you'd say. So I was attending this meeting, and this guy's talking about coal seam gas wells and gas wells in particular. And my mother raised the question. I said, what happens to them once they're decommissioned, once you've depleted all the gas from the coal seam gas wells underground? And this response was very rude, ignorant and dismissive of a sovereign matriarchal elder of Iman people in that particular time at that meeting when they were supposed to be engaging appropriately with us about what was happening on our country. And that really upset me, and it made me realise that I particularly wanted to change my discipline and not focus on mechanical engineering. I'd done that for close to 12 years after leaving school at 15 and doing my trade. And I wanted to focus on more the sustainability lens and what it meant for country and, you know, conservation and land management type sort of things. And I studied at RMIT in my undergrad, and there's a place, an Indigenous education unit called in the Kgari Centre, which is a safe space and inclusive space for Indigenous students at RMIT. So I met lots of great friends there. It was a community to go and study. There was computers and such. There still is now. It's a great place. Still have connections to that place. And And I picked up a program booklet during mid-semester break, and was scrolling through it like, oh, what other degrees or study fields are aligned to my moral and ethical compass that I can give back to my community while I'm away from community getting a higher degree. And I come across sustainable systems engineering, and I was very like, wow, what is this? I haven't heard of this as an engineering field before, From this, I started studying sustainable systems engineering, got some credits from mechanical engineering, changed into that field. Greatly enjoyed it. That was life cycle assessment, materials analysis, sustainable systems design, remote area power supply, all these sorts of things. Besides, the coding classes and other things you have to do as well. So it's kind of like a melting pot of different disciplines focused on that sustainability lens, and different archetypal behaviours that exist within society and the world that, can help inform systems change, which is what, I'm currently about through my research, is that systematic change. So from that, I did an honours degree. That is that. My capstone year project, I met a professor, Matthew Carell, who's now my PhD supervisor. I met him through, I think it was the second year, I mentored as part of the Victorian Indigenous Engineering Winter School, which is a partnership between Melbourne Uni, RMIT, Monash and Swinburne, where Indigenous students from around the country, aged 15 to 17, come down here to Naarm, Melbourne, to check out the universities and different engineering practices. And I met my current supervisor at this. He was, I think, the sort of reconciliation advisor within the School of Engineering at RMIT, and he was involved with this particular views camp. And we got along. I'd done, I think, an MC talk as part of David Unipen's, engineering for RMIT. I started to build a pretty healthy relationship up with his supervisor, and blackfell away, sussed him out, is he trustworthy and things like this outside of even the academy, and is he good for country and stuff like this. Yes, great, good relationship, good working relationship, and even good personal relationship now. And he's a hydrogeologist, so that means underground water science, right? Very passionate about that. Does a lot of stuff around the country with Wangan and Jungalingu mob up there with the Dumbabula Springs complex, with Adani and such like that, and down here in Victoria and around the way. And he suggested to me and reached out before my honours year if I wanted to do a project focusing on clean drinking water for a remote community in the Goldfields region in Western Australia. So it's a very remote community, 8 hours drive northeast of Kgari. I think it's got a small plane strip that hardly can get the plane there anyway. And I was working with my supervisor in my honours project and a doctor, a paediatrician I believe it's called, who'd synthesised the link between nitrate and uranium in bore water that was drinking water for community, and infant mortality rates and blue baby syndrome and chronic kidney disease in this community. And my supervisor approached me and said, hey, do you want to be involved with this pilot program working with University of Queensland, RMIT, the doctor, the senior lawman of the community, and this external company who does clean water projects. So we designed a pilot project with 3 different technologies to clean the groundwater: reverse osmosis, ion exchange and solar distillation, and piloted that project so it was in the shipping container, tested it here in Melbourne. And that was not only about technology, right, for the community. It's not just people that aren't from that community coming in and being like, here's a quick fix to this really intense problem about your, poor quality drinking water in Western Australia. And in this project, there was 2 other students with me in my honours. One looked at tech, the other looked at appropriate tech and ways to clean the water. And I was really interested in the community governance and policy and the social aspect of that, even though I've done my engineering degree. And I was I looked at the Ombudsman report and how terrible that was in relation to all the communities and remote Indigenous communities in WA who'd suffered from poor drinking water that wasn't to the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines standard as a basic human right. And then I realised through that study and the literature review of that sort of topic area that a lot of around the same time this Ombudsman report come out was the same time I think the Abbott government was wanting to close down a lot of remote communities because they didn't want to deal with the issue of supplying clean water, right? And I also found out some of the extractive industry in that area from the gold mining was supposed to be servicing the wells and the way to clean the water, and there was like overdosing of chlorine in the system, things like this that wasn't appropriate. So through that honours year, I got heavily involved in that sort of research, more that social science-based research and humanitarian type sort of research. I wouldn't even call it humanitarian, just like, I guess, trying to make aware of the nuances and of that situation and the injustices of that from an engineering and Indigenous standpoint. Yeah, so my PhD project and position at RMIT, I'm a Vice Chancellor's Indigenous Research Fellow, or PhD candidate, which is a 4-year timeline of limited teaching duties, some professional activities and research to obtain a PhD. So my PhD project is about the coal seam gas industry, and more particular the extractive industry as a whole operating on sovereign Indigenous land in Central Queensland. Both my country, Iman Country in Central Queensland, and the surrounding areas, focusing on both the surface water and the groundwater, the cultural values of each of those, and how the extractive industry may impact on the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples of those area, and both the totemic species that identify country and kin of that area, and the unique biodiversity and ecosystems, the groundwater dependent ecosystems of that area, and just combining both. Well, I wouldn't say combining, I don't really like that. It's more, Western science and an engineering background meeting an Indigenous standpoint, both with, qualitative research and quantitative research. The qualitative being doing field work on country, collecting water samples of surface water, checking different ecotox values, both for inorganics, organics, heavy metals and such and things like this. The other thing is interviewing elders of my mob. So one-on-one interviews like we're doing now that I've, curated through a high-risk ethics application that I'd done to engage with, them as elders and have that really intimate one-on-one time with, older generations that aren't often treated and respected the way they should be and haven't been in past from Western institutions and academic institutions. Often Western institutions have been very extractive in their nature, so coming from more that Indigenous standpoint and Indigenous ways of being, doing and knowing, and my reciprocal relationship with my own community in an ethical way, and having those really rich yarns that can also tell through a thematic analysis of those elders and their experience pertaining to water on country, both above and below ground, different sites, different meanings, different reasons as to why things are and the way things have been done and maybe could be done better. Where we found high levels of boron from fieldwork last year from different areas. There's other researchers now reaching out to me who are like, oh, that was actually where some of your research that come out that we've done recently as part of the Hydrology Water Research Symposium, highlighting some of these issues. There's now other academics in this sort of space that reach out and be like, oh, there was a spill at one of the wells a few years ago because the petroleum industry, they didn't use the correct piping for their wellhead. It was like copper instead of 216 stainless and things like this. And that's only, it's in proximity to areas we'd found that were high levels of toxins and such. So combining, like I say, both that Western science, well, not combining, meeting halfway, and how they can complement each other, and that two-way learning, I guess you'd say, as well. And now, yeah, I'll finish at that. Yeah, of course. So water colonialism, briefly, I'll try briefly, because there's a lot of history there. You may have heard the term terra nullius, Van Diemen's Land, there's no one here, you know, no one has connection to this place and the many different nations within this place. So water colonialism is like, you can think of aquanullius. So, and on a systematic level, you know, Virginia Marshall is a Wiradjuri author and academic, did a book a few years ago on the seminal works Aquanullius, Securing Aboriginal Water Rights, from more that like legal perspective, and talks heavily on aquanullius and water colonialism and what that means for our mob. And just quick stats are like, you know, we make up all land within this colony of Australia is Indigenous land, right? There's some connection from an Indigenous group to that place. Not only that, there's water. So people talk about land back and you know, reparations, but without water back and removing that water colonialism, you can't have land back. So water colonialism is like 2% of the water licenses in Australia, less than, owned by Indigenous people, probably less. The Murray-Darling Basin Indigenous nations are still waiting for millions upon millions of dollars from the federal, you know, government and environment minister to administer those water licenses and funds back to those communities. Things like this. Water colonialism is weirs put in place on Iman Country that shouldn't have been there, that have now flooded areas that shouldn't have been flooded. Water colonialism is some of my ancestors' remains now being, you know, shown from erosion from some of these practices on country where, you know, that Taroom Aboriginal Reserve I spoke of earlier, there's now ancestral remains that have actually been, you know, are coming up from erosion of the waterways and the surface waters. So they're types of water colonialism that people may not understand, or, you know, the industry extracting water and those, you know, the modern day water licenses and who gets to actually trade on that water market, and are any Indigenous people on that water market? Are there users outside of the irrigators and, you know, the extractive industry? Is there benefits for Indigenous people, both economically and socially and culturally, for community if they were to have access to those water? I can guarantee there is, through both, you know, some of my research in the early stages in these 2 years and other Indigenous academics in this space that have been here for a long time before me as well. Yeah, so a different model to manage water would be, you know, we speak of Indigenous ranges, you know, in Indigenous protected areas up in the Daintree in Queensland. There could be similar ideas like Indigenous independent ranges. Recently I heard from I believe he was an Ojibwe man from around the Toronto area in Turtle Island, First Nations over there, at a conference I attended, and he speaks of the importance of gathering baseline independent Indigenous water data, things like this, monitoring our own waterways and what that means for us, based on our principles, our cultural principles, not what is forced upon us through, you know, some sort of standard that isn't actually what I've been found is not actually followed, these water standards, and, you know, the ecotox levels are above what they should be for different users in different environments within both the surface water and tributaries of those areas that are populated by coal seam gas wells. So, you know, some of those culturally supported methods are having, you know, a cultural advisor with you when you are out on country, if you're a scientist going to collect water, or if you're an ecologist, or, you know, you're going to sample different species of that area. Is there anyone who's a traditional owner that can go and walk that country with you to ensure you're doing things in a culturally appropriate way? And I can guarantee from, you know, experience of students I've supervised that have been on my country with a cultural advisor to collect water, they've greatly benefited from that, to the point now one of them's actually doing a PhD in that area focusing on water, and are really passionate about it. And that is from, you know, learning from the community of that area that's connected to that area, the Indigenous peoples of that area. So that's more about those culturally supported scientific methods and combining those, you know, elders' voices with some of this, you know, numbers and data. Yeah, I can go into detail a little bit about that. So in relation to, you know, where the extractive industry reps sit and wanting to engage with this research, and, you know, the different, I guess, stakeholders, those that are involved, you have private landholders on freehold land that isn't native title land on native title determined country. So there's nuances with that. You have, cotton farmers on country, you have cattle farmers, the irrigators and such that are water users as well. And then you have the extractive industry, the jobs that they make and create and economic gains from that in that area. And then you also have traditional owners and such. And it's a very, politicising topic, and as an academic you don't want to get too involved in that, of course, from an ethical and academic standpoint. And when you ask about whether the extractive industry want to engage in this research, I guess there was particular one representative from one of the companies who had a native title meeting reach out to me after realising some of the work I'd been doing, and wanted to engage further. And I said, here's my email, here's my contact, and I'm yet to hear from them. So I guess face value there is, and some of the extractive industry, they're very big on marketing. So at our NAIDOC Day on country, last year when fieldwork was undertaken, there's big marquees of all the extractive industry businesses and hats they give out and things like this, and they're really promoting, we engage with the community and we're for the community, without, going into the detail about, well, you can be like that, but what about that poison creek, or what about the fact you want to release, 15 megalitres of produced water into the river systems that are going to affect these totemic species that are identified different clan groups within Iman Nation. They don't really want to talk about that. It's just that sort of face value thing. And from my standpoint, I'm more interested in hearing from community. I think for too long we haven't heard from community and their standpoint and viewpoint. And often, I guess, the industry in itself promote and have their promotions heavily. I'm sure when more publications come out, they might, reach out to me more and want to be involved. Potentially, I know for some community members, they may work with the industry, and there's good relationships there. And the reason they may work with the industry is, if you look on one of the extractive industry's websites, there's a bit of an interview there, and it's about how the Iman person and knowledge holder and the cultural heritage worker wants to work there to ensure when they're doing their operations, they're not going to bulldoze a burial tree or a scar tree or a culturally significant site. And my sort of research goes further to that and looks at, well, if we have the Cultural Heritage Act in Queensland, and the Indigenous land use agreements, cultural heritage management plans, how is the policy and governance of that done, and what is the legislation needs to be put in place to make those stronger and incorporate, water sovereignty for our people in a more stronger sense as well. So there's a lot of nuances, especially when you're working with your own community, but there's also benefits of me working with my own community. I spoke a little earlier about my honours degree and working with a different Indigenous community in remote Western Australia. My PhD actually started with that clean drinking water, groundwater for them for the first 3 months. And after reflexivity, thinking about my positionality within that research and more learning from the social sciences and humanities, and being drawn back to my own country and realising I'm down here for another 4 years while I study, and there's all this stuff going on home, and we're just trying to keep up. The gas supply security projects is going to be 22,000 wells in that area. And I'd realised through that method of reflexivity and my positionality within it, I wanted to focus back on this research. So that is how working with my own community came about, and the need for that. There was a huge need for that, and wanting to give back after being away for so long and studying and get a higher degree, being in a privileged position to do that, as much as I've worked really hard to be in the position I am. And that then also from, going to meetings from a very young age with my mob about, our land rights, there's always, family, community relationships and such. So it's easier when, you have those relationships already built. I'm not, say, I guess, an outsider. I'm an insider within this research, but I'm also an outsider as someone who's in a university institution. That's my position. And regarding recruiting for interviews, that is more so when I first started doing some of the research, I reached out straight away to the Elders Working Group and the PBC board members who, engage the most with the petroleum industry. And because they engage the most with the petroleum industry in high level of executive meetings, they're some of the best people to talk to about, what is that experience like? Is there free, prior and informed consent with that relationship and agreement making through Indigenous land use agreements and cultural heritage management plans? So that's part of that recruitment process, and it was something as simply as like a phone call, initially I'd done a presentation on some of my early findings and just disseminated some of my research in a plain language. And I just said, hey, you mob, do you know what's happening on country with this particular water release? And that was both co-produced water and RO releases being planned by a company at the Fairview in June site to release these toxins into the waterway. And they're like, oh no, we don't know much of that. We were told reverse osmosis water is very clean. We didn't know about the co-produced water on top of that. So I just shared from a plain language sense and point of view what was happening to those elders. And one of the elders raised their hand in that presentation and said, hey nephew, can you send us a survey? Like I want to be involved, I want to hear more, I want to talk about this. So that led to then those interviews. It led to an ethics application, and that involves 4 different key areas and methods, which is interviews with the elders of the board who deal most with the extractive industry through those executive meetings, shorter surveys with broader community members, follow-up yarning circles and dissemination of that through those yarning circles. So there's some of those methods, and that's from that Indigenous standpoint and that reciprocal participatory approach with my own community. Yeah, that was a really big thing within the method. Is I didn't want to just do the elders or those that were on the PPC board. I really wanted to, and they represent each family and clan group within Iman Nation as well. So there's, you're giving everyone and part of that community an opportunity, because some as well, they may not be on the board, but they're still involved with community, of course, that go to the meetings. And then that's why I have the follow-up surveys with broader community and have greater numbers and data through a shorter survey rather than an in-depth, 1 hour interview where I have to transcribe and the thematic analysis of that. Yeah. Indigenous standpoint and ways of knowing being useful for natural resource management, I guess, is a huge benefit to the broader community, not only Indigenous community, in the sense that it recognises past wrongdoings and it comes up with new ways and better ways and more appropriate and respectful ways to do and engage with community, better science that incorporates, Indigenous sovereign voices of that country that often hasn't incorporated those voices. There's, an example, some of the work Professor Anne Paulina's doing in the Matawara Fitzroy Rivers, there, and it goes into more detail about the benefits of having Indigenous academics speaking on, natural resources like water and better ways to manage water. Some of the other benefits outside of reconciling, or not even reconciling, just acknowledging the past injustices from, the first people that used the water for their sheep farms that destroyed Bora sites and ceremonial dancing grounds because they were flat plains on country, to now, the farmers, to then the extractive industry that are, extracting that water resource as well. When we think of Indigenous ways of being, doing and knowing, we are involving community and Indigenous people in a sovereign way to ensure their wishes are done appropriately. And without that, I think a lot of natural resource management is lacking. It's from a Western standpoint. I think when you think of the 65,000 plus years of natural resource management of Indigenous people, the Gunditjmara eel traps, the Burrawurruna fish traps up, in New South Wales, you think, when I speak a bit about water colonialism, you've got the Yarra River and the waterfall that used to be there between the Salt and Fresh, and that being blown up, and the harm that's caused between different neighbouring tribes and such. Water plays an integral role as a natural resource to Indigenous communities. Often it can be a boundary, often it can be a meeting place, often it can be places of great cultural significance for different specific ceremonies. It can be a place of mourning and healing as well, and it can be places where you're not supposed to go at all. And I think some of those sort of values and principles aren't incorporated within the way that things have been done. Look at the position we're in now around the world regarding climate change and things like that. And I could go into more detail about the fires, the stuff like that, the floods. How has Western natural resource management led and contributed to that? Is another way of thinking about things. Yeah, of course. So some of the outcomes and objectives are to disseminate simply as a starting point some of the voices and concerns from traditional owners that have never been published before, right? It's always been, from the other rather than from an Indigenous standpoint of way of doing and knowing. So that's really important and an objective I want to do. I want to tell our story from our way, right? So that's a really great objective I'm looking forward to in itself as a baseline. Another objective is something even recently through the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. I was working with an ecologist, lawyer, and some other academics, and we submitted a public submission to the EPBC, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and the federal government as part of a water release on country where they were going to release co-produced water. And that was the first time in that area a public submission had incorporated cultural values of water as well as Western science reasons as to why that maybe not should go ahead and some of our concerns. And from that publication and submission to the EPBC Act as part of the water trigger, we gave our advice to the Federal Environment Minister. We also sent her a co-signed letter from community from Woorabinda, up on, Woolly Country, Gungaloo Country, Iman Country, Darumbal Country. Others got involved and signed that and raised our concerns as well as that public submission. From that, some of the early, objectives from this research about protecting country and kin and totemic species and groundwater and surface water, we had a win where the actual Federal Environment Minister knocked back that, and before she would even knock back that, the company actually said, "Oh no, we're not going to release co-produced water anymore." And I'm sure that is from the feedback that was given from us to the Federal Environment Minister that was then passed on. So that's a huge win that's already happened and an objective in the early stages in the second year of this research that I didn't realise could happen in the academic spaces, as particularly as a PhD student. I thought, you're in a very pinpoint silo of information and knowledge that you're going to give back and make society a better place for that. And, you're sitting at a desk going away, you're doing your literature reviews and the field work. But it's great to see that already in the early stages of this project, there's been practical outcomes that have then led to the protection of country and kin and cultural values of water. Other long-term, and when I finish outside of just, hearing from Iman peoples about that water is, hopefully these different ways of water management can help, surrounding communities and other communities that are facing, heavily densely populated gas fields or, the proposal of gas. You have the Beetaloo Basin, you have the Gomeroi mob with the Narrabri gas and the pipelines associated with that. So I'm not trying to homogenise the Indigenous experience within the colony. However, I'm saying that there is similarities there from a sovereign standpoint that some of this research may help benefit and inform, and we're already seeing that with other communities reaching out and wanting to be involved and learning from that, first publication. So there's some of the benefits as well. And then, I see it, I think, long-term, changing policy and legislation. I'm a Lynn Brake Scholarship winner as part of the department. It was at the time Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, now Department Energy, Environment, Climate Change and Water. And that scholarship was about protecting the Great Artesian Basin in Queensland. Lynn Brake was an amazing academic who'd done a lot of great work capping bores in the Gab to protect the underground water. And from that scholarship, I now can, present some, early reports and disseminate presentations to the Great Artesian Basin Senior Advisory Committee, who advise the Federal Environment Minister, and they advise policy makers in every state and territory in the country pertaining to water, in particular with the GAB. So already there's things like that as well that are happening, that are informing policy and legislation change and different ways of being and doing and knowing, and how we see and our relationship and reciprocal relationship with waterways. And I hope that continues into the future with some of this research, and when it's published, and that, more publications on the way and such. Yeah, so in this moment in history relating to Indigenous research within Australia, so-called Australia, we have different topical areas. So currently we have the referendum coming up as well, and there's some great research coming out of Get Up and Larissa Baldwin, Bundjalung woman there, and some of the work they're doing, and activist work they're doing in relation to the referendum. There's also Datani known as Brown and Millie Telford at Australian Progress that are doing things with Common Ground, which was a conference in Meanjin, gathering of change makers, and what do the change makers who are Indigenous around the country, all around the country, want to see. So that's some of that, forefront research at the moment, Indigenous research in the country as well, that's going to have huge impacts in different areas as well. There's also, from a health standpoint, an Indigenous health humanities standpoint, there's Professor Chelsea Watergo in Meanjin and Queensland, who's doing amazing research on, racial injustices within the health system as well. That's going to have huge impacts for Indigenous community in the country. There's also, from, talking about health and that, there's also, we think about health of country. There's fire research coming out and cultural burning practices from Indigenous standpoints. There's Professor and Arnie Ampolina in the Matawara Fitzroy River and the personhood of that, river. That was the first paper in the country where there was an author noted as a river. The Matawara was an author within that publication. It's the first of its kind. There's Brad Mogridge, a Gomeroi Indigenous water scientist as well in New South Wales, that speaks on underground water and the cultural values of underground water within the country. He's like one of, if not the only person besides myself doing that sort of research in the country. That's well overdue. So there's some sort of, I guess, different topic areas where there's a lot of, Indigenous research within the country that's, really at the forefront at the moment, and will have a lot of impact, I think.